Welcome, friends and supporters, and those of you who are new to AE911Truth, Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. My name is Richard Gage, AIA, and I am the founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth and an architect for 28 years now. And we are in week 4 of our webinar, and I want to introduce you also to our operating coordinator, Mr. Andy Steele.
Hi, Richard. Thank you so much for letting me help out. And before we get started, I just want to remind everyone the YouTube video that broadcasts this webinar automatically defaults to a low resolution. So to get the best resolution and watch the webinar in clear quality, just click on the gearbox on the lower right-hand side of the screen and select 720 HD resolution. Back to you, Richard.
Thanks, Andy. And we are going to be talking today about the World Trade Center Twin Towers in week 4. Last week, we covered the introduction of the Twin Towers, the evidence of explosions, and today we're going to be looking at some additional features. But first, I want you to know just a little bit about me for those of you who are unfamiliar. I have, in the 28 years I've been an architect working on lots of different kinds of structures, including these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums, construction documents, construction administration for the whole high school, $125 million high school. More recently, I've worked on this $400 million project near Las Vegas, with 1,200 tons of fireproofed steel framing in a series of retail malls and mid-rise office space and parking structure. So I'm joined recently over the last 10 years, actually, by 2,500 other architects and engineers who are, along with me, demanding a new investigation of the destruction of all 3 skyscrapers on 9/11. And we have some very serious concerns that we're going to be focusing on today, specifically relative to extreme heat in the Twin Towers, with pyroclastic-like clouds, molten steel or iron seen in the rubble pile in the basements. Iron microspheres also, which we'll get into, evidence of thermite and nano-thermite. So we'll talk about all of that. First, I want to introduce you to how this official story was developed. Let's listen.
On September 11th, we learned that 4 passenger planes were hijacked and taken radically off course. Within an hour, 2 of the planes had flown into the enormous steel towers of the World Trade Center, creating fires and eventually toppling them. Dazed by the news, the American public soon believed the fires in the towers had burned so hot they caused the steel frames of the buildings to give way. A myth developed, fed by official sources through the media to a bewildered audience. Elements of the myth: the impact of the airplanes, gallons of burning jet fuel, steel melting, the buildings failing and suddenly imploding. In a mere 10 seconds, 110 stories hurtled earthward, pulverizing into dust. Right from the start, on the street itself, the official story was born.
Come out of nowhere and just scream right into the side of the Twin Tower, exploding through the other side. And then I witnessed both towers collapse, one first and then the second, mostly due to structural failure because the fire was just too intense.
The myth bled into the FEMA report and was echoed by the experts.
It was the combination of the impact load doing great damage to the building, followed by the fire that caused collapse.
Well, there is the official story in a nutshell, but does it stand up to the facts, to the evidence? The facts and evidence that the media, the government, has not given us. The government in the form of NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who took over this investigation rapidly and was tasked by Congress with explaining to the American people what happened to these 3 towers. In order to do that, we look at this with the scientific method. We've had it for 100 years or so in the West, and so we apply it. It works. We have a question. How did the towers come down? We do some background research. We make some observations. And we looked in the last 3 weeks very particularly about what kinds of research has been very helpful. So I certainly encourage our listeners to look carefully at the previous week 1, week 2, and week 3 presentations, which are archived on YouTube for you, and you can click right on our website. But we construct a hypothesis. It's our best guess. How did we think these towers came down? Maybe they came down by fire. Maybe they came down by explosions. We don't rule out any hypothesis. Every reasonable hypothesis is laid out. We make some predictions based on those hypotheses and test them with experiments. We analyze the results. We draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so others can build on the body of our work. We don't hide our data in a black box and say, nope, sorry, you can't have access to our computer models, as NIST has said, because it might jeopardize public safety. Wow. How can the public safety be jeopardized by giving the information to the architects and engineers who design these buildings? We're insured to, we are there to ensure the public safety, ensure. So we're going to apply the scientific method our way with an open, transparent manner. And by the way, if your hypothesis is not corroborated, what do? You go back and you find a hypothesis that stands a better chance against the evidence, against the data. So let's do just that. How have other typical controlled demolitions been brought down, or have brought down skyscrapers, for instance? This is one of the features, one of the key elements of research that we did in week 1, for instance. We found a series of 10 features of typical controlled demolition, all of which can't be explained by fire, all of which are direct evidence of explosive destruction. So this was very helpful research. I encourage you to take a look at it, especially with additional corroborative evidence, government documentation, what do the experts say, foreknowledge of the destruction, video documentation. That's all proof of controlled demolition. So we're halfway through this list, and we are going to take a more focused look this week at near freefall pace through the path of greatest resistance, because this building comes down very fast. And then we're going to look at what some of the possibilities are for the destruction of the building. First, how fast did the building come down? Take a look. Yeah, NIST says it came down at free fall, essentially at free fall. We find it's not quite that fast, but it is still accelerating. It takes about a dozen seconds. Listen to David Chandler.
We are here tracking the motion of the roof line at 0.2 second intervals through approximately 32 meters or 8 stories. This graph shows the height of the roof line as a function of time. The analysis is simpler if we plot velocity as a function of time. On this kind of a graph, a straight line indicates constant acceleration. First, note that there is a sudden onset of collapse. as the point we are tracking makes a sudden transition from being at rest to an approximately constant downward acceleration. The slope of the graph indicates that the acceleration is 6.31 meters per second squared downward, which is 64% of free fall. In other words, once it starts falling, the upward resistive force is only 36% of the weight of the falling section of the building. So far, so good. But now turn it around. Newton's third law says interactions between objects work both ways. The forces two objects exert on each other are always equal and opposite. If the upward force acting on the falling block is 36% of the weight of the falling block, the downward force exerted by the falling block must be exactly the same, 36% of the weight of the falling block. In other words, the top section of the building is exerting less force on the lower, stronger, undamaged structure than it would if it were simply sitting motionless. Therefore, as long as the top section of the building is in uniform downward acceleration, it cannot possibly be providing sufficient force to destroy the building.
This is really important information from this physics teacher, David Chandler. After all, the top portion of the building is said to be crushing the rest of the building. Look how much steel is in this building, 100,000 tons, about 80,000 tons of structural steel below the point of jet plane impacts that is said to be being crushed at nearly free fall acceleration. As he said, 64, 66% of free fall. This is, compare this, you can visualize this quite rapidly here. If we drop a 15-story section of the North Tower over, say, 80,000 tons of structural steel on the left, and on the right we drop the same body over nothing but air, which one is going to hit the ground first? Well, NIST is basically implying that they hit the ground at the same time. For instance, virtually no delay on the part on the left side. Of course, that makes no sense. Even a child can understand that this doesn't work. How might we expect the top portion to behave in a more probable gravity-driven collapse?
Something of this kind is what we should have seen when the top section of the towers collapsed onto the lower one. The upper and lower sections should have mutually destroyed each other until all the energy is dissipated and the system comes to a rest. Alternatively, as shown in this experiment with two towers made of snow, the top section could have fallen off to the side after the initial collapse. What could not have happened is this.
A little tiny chunk of the building can't possibly fall and crush the entire structure below it.
This is such a simple, fundamental concept that architects and engineers were astonished in seeing it totally ignored by NIST.
This is high school physics, and our whole society is being led to believe that these fundamental laws of physics, hard science, don't apply anymore.
Well, I think we've made the point here. In fact, Tony Zambodi, in a couple of different papers that are peer-reviewed at the Journal of 911studies.org or .com, makes the point and basically concludes here in a rebuttal to the Zdenek-Bezant paper, which came out on September 13th, just 2 days after 9/11. He says, in Tony's conclusion, assuming even a modest resistance of columns during their destruction would cause an unacceptably long collapse time, meaning that it completely contradicts the NIST theory. So let's take a look, though, at some of the measures, some of the examples or evidence of extreme heat here, starting with NFPA 921, the National Fire Protection Association's Guide for Investigation of Fire and Explosions, which NIST had quite a hand in helping to develop, but who did not follow the very simple guidelines here for these investigations. We're talking about looking for blast pressure wave effects, which we talked about much evidence for last week, and thermal effects, which we're focusing on this week. Large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released, rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases, which occur, in fact, before, during, and directly after the final destruction of the Twin Towers As you can begin, as you see here, right at the onset of the destruction, thick cauliflower-shaped clouds indicating incredible hot gases with the unfolding on itself. A very, very distinct series of clouds that have a thick edge also. Very different from typical controlled demolitions, which have a vapory cloud-like appearance. Let's take a look at some evidence of extreme heat here, which includes pools of molten iron and microspheres in the World Trade Center dust, previously molten iron microspheres. But Bechtel points out that temperatures in their measurements 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. This is way hotter than jet fuel or office fires even get. So where are these temperatures coming from? This is about the melting point of iron or steel. Richard Garlock, who worked for Leslie Robertson, who designed the World Trade Center Twin Towers, in fact, the structural engineer, he says the debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running. Other first responders have a lot to say about this molten metal. Saw pools of literally molten steel at the World Trade Center, says the president of the cleanup company. Seeing a crane lifting a beam vertically, it was dripping from the molten steel. Seeing the molten steel, uncovering red hot metal beams, and molten iron or steel is seen pouring out of the South Tower at the point of jet plane impacts for the 10 minutes prior to the collapse. It's a bright yellow liquid, but so NIST says, oh, that must be a melted airplane. But molten aluminum is silvery in appearance, as you see here, in daylight conditions. It doesn't glow bright red, bright yellow, or bright white hot, as we even saw. Seeing the molten steel, uncovering red hot metal beams, says this first responder, ranging from molten metal, which is still red hot weeks after the event. Molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains. Molten steel beams, streams of molten metal leaked in the hot cores and flowed down the broken walls. Metal dripping from the beam, dripping molten steel, as you see here in the material with liquid falling metal, molten metal. Steel members in the debris pile appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. Partly evaporated. It takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel. Where does that kind of temperature comes from? It's seen here in this piece of steel from World Trade Center Building 7, actually, by Abulhassan Astani, Azal, who had unlimited access to the Fresh Kills landfill where the steel was taken before it was illegally destroyed, evidence in a crime scene, prior to the investigators from the American Society of Civil Engineers. And, hey, I need access to the steel. They didn't get it. I need access to the site. They weren't able to wander around and look for themselves. They were given highly controlled tours. I need access to the blueprints for the building. They were denied access to that as well. But FEMA did manage to put together in their Appendix C of their May of 2002 Building Performance Assessment Report the evidence of their metallurgical examination. What do they find? Never before observed in building fires, eutectic reactions causing intergranular melting capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese, like this piece of steel. Evidence of severe high-temperature corrosion attack on the steel, rapid oxidation, sulfidation, intergranular melting. Liquid iron, that is molten iron. That's 2,800 degrees. Sulfur formed on this hot corrosion attack on the steel. Where does the sulfur come from? Well, sulfur is added to thermite, as you'll see. It becomes thermate. NIST says, well, the sulfur might have come from the gypsum board. Well, gypsum board is used to protect steel. It has never turned around and released its sulfur content in order to attack the steel, which it's designed, in fact, to protect. Every time I tried to breathe in, it burned. The smell of sulfur. I can never block out that smell. It haunts me. The sulfur burning, says this first responder. Where does the sulfur come from? Again, sulfur is used in thermite, cut through steel. In fact, it's found and documented by in the metallurgical examination by FEMA, as is found and is documented in the police museum, melted concrete. I didn't even know concrete could melt. It melts at 3,200 degrees Fahrenheit. These office fires are maybe 500, 600 degrees. NIST says they found no evidence for temperatures exceeding that. But even if it was 1,000-degree fire or 1,800 degrees, as they also claim, the fires got that hot, that's still nowhere near the temperature required to melt steel or concrete, as you see here. This is a gun that the concrete melted like lava and formed itself around this gun in the police museum, handgun. And molten metal meteorites. They've never seen this before.
One of the more unusual artifacts to emerge from the rubble is this rock-like object that has come to be known as the meteorite.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat.
And architects, engineers, people who worked with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
Well, it's not melted aluminum because melted aluminum doesn't rust. So these meteorites appear to, which are brought up deep out of the rubble pile from these cooled molten iron, more likely molten iron as a matter of fact. And these temperatures are actually quite well documented by the satellite infrared photos, which show at World Trade Center 7 temperatures exceeding 1,300 degrees. This is after the fires are out. There's no fires on the surface. We're talking about temperatures beneath the surface in the pile that are much hotter than these temperatures, that radiating upward toward the surface, where the sensitive equipment then picks it up, is cooler at 1,340 degrees at World Trade Center 1, 1,160 degrees Fahrenheit, and 1,377 at World Trade Center 2. The hot spots are indicative of something far greater than fires. And yet this gentleman, John Gross, lead engineer of the NIST report, has this to say about this phenomena.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, and no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel reels, like you're in a foundry.
Yeah.
Like lava.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of a wall.
The cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. Steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
And they pulled off a big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
Leslie Robertson, the engineer, structural engineer of the World Trade Center himself, saw molten steel. And this is John Gross, the lead project, co-project leader, who denies the evidence of this here is found selecting the very beam that was used for the FEMA report, which shows evaporated ends of the steel beams. He denies it, but his shadow is all over the evidence, in fact. Well, is there evidence of thermite or cutter charges in the residue or in the piles found at the site, the World Trade Center towers? And could thermite have produced all that molten metal? And what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Well, maybe we're getting somewhere now. We've got a possible source of the massive heat. We've got a possible source, if it exists, on the site, this material thermate or thermite, of the sulfur. And we've got a possible source for the other phenomena that we've looked at. But again, NIST acknowledges that it never looked for such evidence after claiming that they never found it. A year later, they actually put in writing they never looked for it, and they refused to. But others have looked for it. In fact, Stephen Jones is an example of one of those, and finds that if there was thermite at the site, it would leave behind a unique chemical evidence, common elements such as iron, aluminum, copper, calcium, silicon, but other unusual elements such as fluorine and manganese left behind in the residue. These elements on the periodic table. In fact, he sent a 40-pound chunk of this material. Actually, he sent a piece from it, and he does an analysis on it. What does he find? Well, it's predominantly iron, so he rules out molten aluminum from the jet planes. It's got abundant manganese, so he can rule out molten structural steel as a major component. It's elemental iron, interesting, but it has small amounts of aluminum, sulfur, and potassium. Manganese and fluorine in abundance. Manganese is from the potassium permanganate. It's an oxidizer in thermite. Fluorine is used in very special thermite charges called sol gels. So these are present in the residue, and they are a thermite fingerprint. But it goes on. He sent another piece of steel from this sculpture, the 9/11 monument, and finds that it has X-ray fluorescence. In its X-ray fluorescence analysis, it finds iron, sulfur, potassium, manganese in abundance. So that's also a confirmation. And in this piece from World Trade Center 7 steel, what does he find? We see massive aluminum discharge, if you will, in the ends of this very jaggedly cut piece. When they're cutting with thermal lances or oxyacetylene torches, they make straight cuts like this. That's very different than what you just saw. And from this piece at the International Peace Park in Manitoba, we find also more aluminum and a very jaggedly cut piece, and which includes again the elements of thermite in its X-ray dispersive spectroscopy analysis. In fact, there are devices that you can make in your home. Not John, not in your home, but at home. John Cole, civil engineer, put this together himself and found that he could cut straight through a beam with homemade thermite cutter charges that are shaped and directed where the thermite cuts through with liquid molten iron. In fact, There are patents designed to do just that, that issue particle streams of molten iron in hundreds of milliseconds, cutting through very thick steel. These are inventions that are done, filed well before 9/11, so were available. And there are also inventions that actually have their casings made of consolidated thermite, which would leave no trace or no cutter charges, only pools of molten iron, which of course have been found at the World Trade Center. Sol gels, being a very special form of thermite cutter charges, would have left behind a unique chemical 1,3-diphenyl propane. Interestingly enough, the EPA's analysis finds one molecule at present levels that dwarfed all others, 1,3-diphenyl propane. We've never observed it in any other sampling we've done, says Eric Schwartz of the EPA. Fascinating. What was found, though, in the powder that was so ubiquitous, laid like a blanket across lower Manhattan in a 3-square-mile area, 4 inches thick? Well, R.J. Lee Group, an environmental firm doing consulting on the toxicological studies on the dust, finds these curious spherical particles. They are molten iron, previously molten iron spheres. This is incredible evidence because they don't know where they came from. There's about 10 tons of this material as extrapolated by other scientists. The USGS finds them. They document them very carefully. They're elemental iron, up to 6% of the dust in some of the samples is these curious spheres. So they say, well, this is a signature component. They're in all the samples. We don't know what it is, but it's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has this unexplained, previously molten iron spheres. Well, Dr. Stephen Jones, an independent researcher, finds them as well, does his own analysis on this material along with R.J. Lee Group. They find that they have the signature of thermite, molten iron, aluminum, etc. Here's an experiment of how this material works. And slowing that down, you see issuing just from this small sample, thousands and thousands of what? Small molten iron microspheres that cool by the time they hit the dustpan there. Could that be responsible for the corrosion of the tops of these cars, which many are curious about? Liquid falling, cooling, molten iron droplets. And what else was found in the World Trade Center dust? In 4 independently collected samples, actually 6, but they ended up documenting 4 of them, they find the same curious red-gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other. About 1/16 of an inch long, they're multi-layered, indicating they may have been applied by a fluid, leading some to believe that this is paint. However, zooming into the red side, and doing an analysis with XEDS again, they find iron, aluminum, silica, oxygen, carbon, key elements of thermite with organic material. Interesting. In fact, they zoom into the red layer 50,000 times. What do they find? Extremely small particles of iron oxide and aluminum powder that are 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of the human hair. This is nanoscale particles, which are not created by grinding something down. This is built from the atomic scale up, a very high-tech process. And these materials, which are the ingredients of thermite, are in the correct proportion to make up thermite, and they're set in an organic bed of oxygen, silica, and carbon. That's organic material, which is designed, like for instance in TNT, or RDX, high energy explosives. That does the work, the pressure work, because it forms into a gas. So here you have an incendiary, which is designed by its small size to become more explosive because of the massive surface area. due to the small size of the particles. Plus, with this organic material, becomes more explosive. It's engineered to become more explosive. In fact, all 4 samples ignite at 420 degrees centigrade, about 800 or 900 degrees Fahrenheit. They ignite. They have more energy in them. Paint doesn't do this, by the way. And this mimics the behavior of experiments done in the development of nanothermite, as we have come to know by Los Alamos lab, Lawrence Livermore lab, because they've released some of that results, but most of it remains fairly highly classified. In fact, when it does ignite, it produces metal spheres, as you see here in experiments, that mimic the chemical signature of the spheres found in the World Trade Center dust, which were unexplained by USGS and RJ Lee. That is fascinating. We know now where those spheres came from, as if we didn't know, because many of these chips were found partially ignited, attached to these very same spheres. So we know that the chips are responsible for the spheres. Paint doesn't do this. Paint doesn't release elemental iron, molten iron spheres. It just doesn't happen like that. And so we have many examples of these. In fact, it's called super thermite, documented by Lawrence Livermore lab and Los Alamos lab well before before 9/11. It's a very high-tech process. This material is made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories, and there's very few examples of such. And so a target for future investigation by criminal investigators is in order here, obviously. And this material, and we've done the work for them, not we, AE911Truth, but this team of scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen documents this very, very carefully in this 25-page peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal, which stands uncontested. No one has put forth a peer-reviewed paper that challenges this work, and that's what you do in the scientific community. We challenge work not by saying, hey, that's paint, or those guys are conspiracy theorists or something like that. No, you put forth your own peer-reviewed paper and challenge it scientifically. So what we believe that we've done in this series of webinars is shown, particularly in week 3 and 4, having to be where we focused on the Twin Towers, the 10 key characteristic features of direct evidence of explosive destruction. Fire has not created any one of these historically, with very, very few exceptions, let alone all 10 of them. So each of them independently are a condemnation of the official story. But let's look a little further at the FEMA report and NIST reports that were created. In fact, Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering Magazine, says it's a half-baked farce, the FEMA investigation, that may already have been commandeered by political forces whose primary interests, to put it mildly, lie far afield of full disclosure. The structural damage from the planes and the explosive ignition of the jet fuel in themselves were not enough to bring down the towers. This is the fire protection engineer who leads a whole group of them in this central nexus of communications of the fire engineering community, the Fire Engineering Magazine. Well, NIST came along and took over the investigation from FEMA and ejected the Appendix C, metallurgical examination, proving extreme hot temperatures, and basically just destroy that evidence by not including it in their final report. We have 10,000 pages, 1,000 pages modeling the airplanes alone. There's a lot of obfuscation and ubiquitous irrelevant detail, 100 pages of life safety issues, which are important but not relevant to the cause of the destructions of the building. So there's only 1/2 page on the events following the collapse initiation. In other words, the actual collapse out of 10,000 pages has 1/2 of a page. Here it is. The structure below the level of collapse initiation offered minimal resistance. The large building mass far exceeded the capacity of the intact structure below to absorb that. It came down in essentially free fall. The floors below were unable to arrest the moving mass. So that's the official story in a nutshell, which we've already just today, and certainly last week, proven could not have happened. This is not an analysis. It's a speculation. And they further acknowledge this in a response to our request for correction, the formal way you have in our country of challenging a government document in its accuracy. They say we're unable to provide a full explanation of the total collapse. That's just amazing after spending $20 million of our taxpayer money on it, to have that acknowledgement. Well, what do our experts say? And other experts too. This is Ronald Brookman, who says it doesn't look anything like a heat-induced gravitational collapse mechanism. Why the collapse of the towers became inevitable makes no sense. Why would all 110 stories drop straight down to the ground in 10 seconds, pulverizing the contents to dust and twisted steel? It's being swept under the rug. Well, William Rice has another interesting way of putting it, a structural engineer, one of about 80 signed on to our petition calling for a new investigation. The interesting fact is that each of these 110-story twin towers fell upon itself in about 10 seconds at nearly free fall acceleration. This violates Newton's law of conservation of momentum that would require that as the stationary inertia of each floor is overcome by being hit, the mass increases and the free fall acceleration decreases. The prevailing theory would have us believe that each of the twin towers inexplicably collapsed upon itself, crushing all 287 massive columns on each floor while maintaining a near free fall acceleration, going faster and faster, as if the 100,000 or more tons of supporting structural steel framework didn't even exist. That's one way to put it. David Scott, structural engineer, says near free fall collapse violates laws of physics. There's a little bit simpler. All three collapses were very uniform in nature. Natural collapses due to unplanned events are not uniform, says this fire protection engineer, signed on to our petition. And this one as well. The jet fuel contributed very little to the duration of the fires, having no resemblance to any previous high-rise fire. He says this could not have happened. And Mathis Levy, who actually supports the official story at this point, said this before.
You've seen many of the managed demolitions where they implode a building and they cause it essentially to fall vertically because they cause all of the vertical columns to fail simultaneously. That's exactly what it looked like, and that's what happened.
Interesting. But he and this gentleman, Ronald Hamburger, contributor to the FEMA report, says it appeared to me, initially he says this, that charges had been placed in the building. Upon learning that no bombs had been detonated, I was very surprised. How did he learn that no bombs had been detonated? There's probably 3, 4, 5 dozen witnesses that heard bombs being detonated. So who told them that no bombs were detonated? Interesting. And they never considered demolition, even though it is the obvious first hypothesis that should have been chosen, because they looked, as we saw last week, particularly in our focus, exactly like controlled demolitions, at least in the first 4 seconds, and then a series of very explosive destruction after that. They completely ignored the hypothesis of fire, which of controlled demolitions, because it looked like that. They went straight to the hypothesis of fire, even though fires never brought down any high-rise ever. Well, is the hypothesis corroborated in your mind? It doesn't matter what we believe. The hypothesis of controlled demolition. Do we have the 10 key characteristic features in the last 2 weeks as we've been developing them? Is this direct evidence of explosive destruction? Can fire create any one of these features, let alone all of them? Is there additional corroborating evidence? Is this proof to you, beyond a reasonable doubt, of controlled demolition? If so, we want to invite you to join us in taking some action steps. We certainly encourage you to sign our petition calling for a new investigation. It's right there on the website. If you're watching on our website, just scroll down below. You can become a member of AE911Truth and join us in getting the word out. There is a lot of work we have to do, going to the AIA conventions like we're going to do in Philadelphia, coming right up here on May 19th. We have a $4,000 booth that we need to bring our evidence to, and we've done this every year, and we've been very well supported. This year we want to make an extra effort because we have a resolution that we've had 97 of our AIA members, American Institute of Architects, calling upon the AIA to call for a new investigation. We'll have that debate on the floor, and we encourage you to support us in that effort. And becoming a member is one great way to do it. You can donate directly to the cause, and you can volunteer. There are many things that you can do. Andy, what are some of the things that people can do to help?
Well, we've got a lot of great outreach projects going on right now, Richard. So if you are watching this webinar and you are moved by this evidence and want to help get this information out to others, you can get involved as a volunteer by simply going to the top of this webpage, AE911Truth.org. You find the What You Can Do tab and select volunteer. Just fill out the form and we'll get you involved in one of our projects that are going out to a lot of people and making a big difference. Also, too, if you want to subscribe to our newsletter, just fill out the form on the top right-hand side of this page and keep updated on all the stuff that AE911Truth is doing.
Fantastic. Thanks for the help there. And by the way, people can also write and contact your elected representatives, television, radio, newspaper, media officials. Tell everybody you know. Send the AE911Truth.org link to every architect and engineer you can find, everybody else that you know. This is a grassroots movement growing by millions since we started. We've got a long haul, though, ahead of us. As you know, we don't have any presidential candidates speaking out about 9/11 and a new investigation. So we are building a public effort, building up to a public outcry, which will put pressure on our government for a new investigation eventually. That's where we're focusing most of our effort, as well as on the academic professionals. You can screen our DVD. I'm going to show you that DVD in a minute. Speak to new audiences. Share the resources in our store. We have brochures, we have DVDs, we have shirts and t-shirts that you can wear. We have our new 50-page booklet that's been receiving great feedback from the academic community. It's designed to enlighten, educate academic professionals, but all types of others have also enjoyed and been illuminated by it very, very much. It comes also with a diskette. So you can see that at the bottom of the page, or if you want to visit the specific website, it's beyondmisinformation.org. And you can sign up. You can get this for free, by the way. Just scroll down. The PDF is right there available. Just put in your email and we'll get it right out to you. And take a look at the 3 minutes here of our latest, not our latest, but our landmark DVD documentary, 9/11 Explosive Evidence, Experts Speak Out, where we have 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out the evidence in greater detail than we were able to get into even today.
conspiracy theories. You know, there are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the document from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nano-thermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. And the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
And indeed, we encourage you to organize a screening, as we're going to do. In fact, in the next 3 weeks in the Pacific Northwest, we're taking this information to Portland, Seattle, Washington, Idaho, and Montana. 13 cities in this tour coming up. So I encourage you to take a look at our, on our website, there's a banner on the right there that'll lead you right to the information about this tour coming up, where Eric Lawyer, founder of Firefighters for 9/11Truth, and I, together on the stage, present the evidence, particularly from the firefighters' side. And it's really incredible, his journey of exposing the work that has been done but covered up by NIST, done by others, firefighters, 200 of which have signed his petition calling for a new investigation. at Firefighters for 9/11 Truth and Unity. So, and so this week we've, of course, focused on the evidence of extreme heat. And next week we'll do the same on Sunday at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. We're back again with this same presentation. Then we'll cycle back to week 1. And so we know we've developed a lot of questions. Andy, I'm sure that that some people have some great questions here. Let's have at it.
Oh, we always get some great questions for these webinars, and so I just want to remind everybody that we try to stick to the questions that relate to the subject that we talked about during this webinar. So questions about Building 7, things like that, we're going to wait to address for future webinars when Richard cycles back around to that. Also, too, we want the questions that stick to the evidence points raised here, suggestions on how we can further our mission should be sent to us, to our contact page, by going to Who Are We tab on the AE911Truth.org site, and just click Contact Us, and you can send our suggestions, and we do read those. Richard, first question I have today is, does NIST explain how the steel beams were melted, and is jet fuel stored in steel tanks?
Yeah, let's take them one at a time, and I'll probably forget the second one, Andy. So thanks for coming back with me on that one. NIST does not explain melted steel. At first, they deny it, as you've heard from John Gross, the co-project leader and author of the NIST report himself. Interestingly enough, they actually say from steel samples selected at their most proximate point to the jet plane impacts, they found no evidence for temperatures exceeding 500 or 600 degrees Fahrenheit. So, and yet they claim somehow that steel temperatures got up also to 1800 degrees or air temperatures, which is extremely unlikely in these low burning fires, especially in the case of the South Tower, which was almost out at the time the tower went down. But you saw then in this presentation all of this evidence for molten steel and iron. So why wasn't it provided? For that matter, why wasn't the evidence provided for the probably amounts to hundreds of witnesses of explosions, as we talked about and saw in last week's presentation? We're looking at evidence of a cover-up, which is a crime in and of itself. AE911Truth is not criminal, is not composed of criminal investigators. We're technical and building professionals. But we certainly are calling for a criminal investigation along with the technical investigation that shows exactly how these buildings could have come down, since they couldn't have come down according to the official story by jet plane impacts and fires.
Okay, and the second part of that person's question, I don't know if we can answer it, but it's an interesting point, is jet fuel stored in steel tanks? I guess the presumption would be that if the tanks are made out of steel, they should melt, according to what NIST says.
Well, if we're referring to the tanks on the airplanes, I'm sure they're not steel. The fuel is generally stored in the wing, which is, I believe, aluminum. If the questioner is referring to tanks of diesel fuel, which were in fact in Building 7, which was originally attributed to the cause of the fires, or the substantial cause of the fires, by NIST even. Sham Sunder, the lead engineer of NIST, but that was later retracted because the jet fuel was stored, the diesel fuel was stored in floor 5, and there were no fires coming out of the louvers in that mechanical floor 5 because they had generators there, and the generators used diesel. So that was a unique feature of this building. Most skyscrapers do not have diesel fuel in them for obvious reasons, but this was built with the authority of under the Port Authority's jurisdiction, and they were able to develop their own codes, liberties.
Okay, our next question is, how much nano-thermite would have had to have been used to bring down each tower?
Well, we don't know too much about the capabilities, the ignition, the explosive force of nanothermite. What we do know is that we have what amounts to up to about 10 tons of residue of thermite and or nanothermite in the form of these small previously molten iron microspheres found by officials in the dust. We do have what amounts to about 10 tons of the unignited residue in the form of these small red-gray chips found by Niels Harrit and his team of scientists. So that can give us a clue that there may have been 20, 30 tons of this material altogether by speculation. And of course, that would have had to have come through under the noses of the security team operating in these 3 World Trade Center skyscrapers. And we certainly want an investigation of the security, because this obviously appears to be some sort of an inside operation. I mean, it's extremely unlikely that Al-Qaeda had access to plant all this material in the elevator hoistways. We certainly want an investigation of ACE Elevator, who had the 9-month modernization project that was going on, the largest elevator modernization in the world, in fact, which could have given operatives access to the core columns and beams in this building that are immediately adjacent to the elevator shafts. In fact, USA documented very carefully the scandal where 85 of these ACE elevator employees fled. They didn't stick around to help the firefighters rescue these victims, because these are experts in the vehicles for the rescue of those victims, the elevator cabs. So that needs to be investigated as well. In fact, ACE Elevator came out of nowhere virtually to obtain the largest contract by an astronomical margin that they ever had, whereas Otis Elevator, who was previously maintaining these, was in the much more preferred position of getting the contract to modernize these elevators, because they had been maintaining them. So there's lots of targets of investigation here, including who makes this nanothermite, who has access to it. It's not too difficult. And who benefited from the events following 9/11. These are the sources of investigations which we are referring the investigators to. If we can find any investigators, we certainly can't investigate we don't have the ability to summon or take oath, take testimony under oath. We've put together our evidence. We've done our investigation, but it's got to happen from a body that has the legal authority to offer immunity, to bring forth witnesses, to take all the evidence under its microscope and force NIST to reveal what they have not revealed. That's what we need, and we're not sure how we're going to get it, but we're not stopping until we do.
Okay, our next question came in right when you were saying that no peer-reviewed paper has challenged the nanothermite paper done by Niels Harrit's team. And the question asks, what about James Millett's paper?
Yeah, James Millett did his own study, and he had some interesting results. He claims that, hey, this is just paint. Well, he didn't submit a paper through a peer-reviewed process. So he's certainly been encouraged to do that. One of the reasons he hasn't may have been because he sabotaged his own experiments by, in one case, not taking those chips in the differential scanning calorimeter, the heater, up to the 420 degree centigrade temperature at which they ignited in the differential scanning calorimeter in the experiments done by Niels Harrit's team. He stopped short of that. Why? Perhaps he didn't want to see the ignition take place, which would have invalidated his conclusion that this is just paint.
Okay. Our next question says, Mr. Gage, I saw an experiment on TV in which they tried to cut a piece of steel with thermite and failed to do it. Would you comment on that?
Yes, we have the Geographical Society. What's it called, Andy?
I think it's called, it's been a while, but I think it's called the National Geographic Channel, and I forgot the name of the show that was on it, if I remember.
These ridiculous experiments in which they poured a bunch of thermite around a column and ignited it, expecting or not expecting the column to be severed. Well, thermite has to be directed by cutter charges, shaped charges. And that's what John Cole did in his backyard, the civil engineer. You saw his video. That's what they do in controlled demolitions, whether it's high energy explosives or incendiaries. In this case, that has to be directed. And we saw the invention that was created that did exactly that, directed and streams of molten iron in milliseconds. It's much more effective at cutting through steel. And so why would they have used it? Why wouldn't they use thermite if it's so effective? It's a lot more expensive, first of all. But these are deceptive controlled demolitions. This is an illusion, a magic show. We're being asked to identify in our minds the destruction of these twin towers with the jet planes and those massive explosions, which we saw of jet fuel an hour or so before these towers came down. And so they wouldn't use high energy explosives like C4 and RDX, which are normally used in controlled demolitions, because they provide a very loud bang, a very bright flash, signatures which would have given it away. So this is apparently the approach that they decided to take and had the budget to do it with thermite incendiaries.
We're getting a couple of questions asking if we found any evidence of thermite cutter charges in the debris at ground zero. Can you comment on that?
Not to our knowledge. We do know that the sifting of the debris was under very controlled circumstances. In fact, for Building 7, it was all shipped to because there's nobody who died, according to the official story, in Building 7. That debris was, well, first of all, the steel was illegally shipped to China, destroyed, recycled. But the remaining debris was taken to a very controlled site, and there were agents of the FBI and the U.S. Customs Service, interestingly, that were actually in charge of sifting this material. We know one of those gentlemen, Carl Gullivan, who actually provided us some steel samples from that pile that he secured. He also gave us some interesting pieces of World Trade Center Building 7's granite panels, which we have as a historical artifact. But I got distracted from the main point there. Would you just remind me, Andy? Where did Andy go?
Sure. Sorry, I had trouble getting off mute there. The question was about whether or not there was evidence of any kind of thermite cutter charges found in the ground zero wreckage that we know of.
Right. So we showed you one example of an invention that was actually made out of consolidated thermite, its casing, with actual thermite inside. So there are devices. So it's possible. We know it's possible to actually have no leftover pieces of cutter charges, because they would be burned up and would only leave a pool of molten iron, plenty of which, of course, was found here. So that's one possible reason we don't have such evidence. And people say, oh, there would have been miles of detonation cord. Well, that's what's used in normal controlled demolitions, but in a job like this, you'd probably have radio-controlled ignition devices of some sort.
Okay, our last question today is a good one to end it on, and it just asks about the outcome of a new investigation if we were to get it, and whether or not, because we appeal for a new investigation, would we expect more obfuscation as if we had one? Can you comment on that?
Well, we're certainly aware that the powers that be, since this is some sort of an inside operation, would want to be controlling any investigation that did occur. In fact, the 9/11 Commission itself wasn't even formed for a year afterward because the administration at the time was avoiding it, and they were forced into it by public pressure brought on by the families of the victims. So we are very sensitive to what investigation we'll get once we get it. But we seem to be so far from the point, having made as much progress as we haven't got anybody in Congress calling for a new investigation. And when we do start to get that, we'll have to take some pretty strong measures to ensure that it is not co-opted, led astray, as other investigations have been, including the 9/11 Commission, which didn't even mention the destruction of World Trade Center 7, the third worst structural failure in modern history that most architects and engineers know nothing about. And most architects and engineers know nothing about the evidence that you've seen today. And that's why we've got such a huge job ahead of us to get this information to them. That's where you come in. That's where we need you to step up. That's where America needs its real patriots to step up. We can give this information out. We can deliver it. But we're only a handful of activists and professionals technical professionals who are working day and night. But we rely on everybody else to get this information that we've created out to the world. So it's your turn to step up.
All right, folks, thank you so much for attending this week's webinar. We're doing it again on Sunday at 4 o'clock Pacific time, 7 o'clock Eastern. So if you are moved by this evidence, show it to somebody else and tell others about these presentations that are happening every week.
Thanks, everybody, and we'll look forward to seeing you on Sunday at 4 p.m. for week 4 repeat. Let everybody know. Until then, we're over and out at AE911 Truth.